People have gotten high for 2,500 years, but the reason they started had nothing to do with it. To understand that, you have to start in a frozen mountain grave near the Pamir Mountains in far western China, almost 10,000 feet up, at a site called Jirzhankal, where archaeologists pulled out a charred wooden bowl, and when they ground a piece of it into powder and ran it through a machine that fingerprints chemicals, they found something nobody expected: cannabis. Not the mild, ropey hemp these people grew for clothing and food, but a variety loaded with THC, the compound that gets you high, stronger than the wild stuff growing around them. Someone had picked it out on purpose. So here's the question that's going to pull you through this whole story. If you lived back then, you weren't smoking to unwind after a long day. You didn't even have a word for recreation. So why would you climb a freezing mountain, build a fire in a bowl, and fill your lungs with smoke on purpose? Stay with me, because the answer is stranger and more human than you'd guess. Let's rewind. Way back, long before anyone lit anything. The cannabis plant is ancient. It beat us here by tens of millions of years. It first took hold in Central Asia near the Altai Mountains, where Siberia, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan blur together. And here's what you have to picture. To the first humans wandering those riverbanks, this plant wasn't a drug at all. It was a grocery store and a hardware store rolled into one. You'd eat the seeds. You'd twist the stalks into rope and weave them into cloth. For thousands of years, that was the entire relationship. Food, fiber, nothing more. Nobody was getting high. Why would they? You can chew raw cannabis leaves all day and feel basically nothing. The plant keeps its secret locked behind a door, and that door only opens with one key: heat. Here's where it gets interesting. The THC in cannabis is barely active until you heat it. Fire flips a chemical switch and wakes it up. So picture the accident. You're sitting by a campfire on a cold night. Someone tosses a bundle of this everyday plant onto the coals, maybe just to be rid of it. The smoke curls up. You breathe it in without thinking, and then the world tilts. Your head floats. Colors feel louder. For people with no chemistry, no science, no way to explain it, that wasn't a buzz. That was a doorway. A plant that could shove your mind somewhere else had to be touched by the spirit world, and we're not guessing. In 2008, archaeologists opened a 2,700-year-old grave near Turpan in that same corner of China. Inside lay the skeleton of a man around 45, and beside him, almost 2 pounds of cannabis, dried and preserved by the desert air. When researchers tested it, it still carried THC after all those centuries. This man wasn't a farmer. The objects buried with him mark him as a shaman, a spiritual specialist of the Gushi people. The cannabis wasn't his snack. It was the tool of his trade. Which brings us back to that smoke-filled bowl, and to the first person in history to write any of this down. His name was Herodotus, a Greek traveler taking notes around 440 BCE, the man we now call the father of history. And he described a people called the Scythians, nomadic horse warriors who ruled the grasslands from the Black Sea deep into Asia, fierce, tattooed, buried with gold. Here's what he says you'd do if you were one of them. After a funeral, you'd lean 3 poles together into a little tent and cover it with felt. You'd dig a pit, drop in stones heated until they glowed, and crawl inside. Then you'd throw cannabis onto those rocks, and the cramped space would flood with thick, choking smoke. There'd be nowhere for it to go. You'd breathe all of it. And Herodotus says the Scythians would start to howl, not in pain, but in something close to joy. He called it their version of a bath. They didn't wash with water, they cleansed themselves in smoke. Sit with that for a second. To them, getting high wasn't an escape from the day. It was a duty you owed the dead. So what did that actually feel like, packed inside that tent? Remember, this wasn't the gentle stuff. The cannabis at these sites was unusually high in THC, and you were inhaling it in a sealed space with nowhere for the smoke to escape. Your heart would start to pound, your mouth dries out. The poles of the tent seem to drift. Time stretches, so a single minute feels like 10. A wave of heat and weightlessness rolls up through your chest, and the grief that brought you there softens at the edges. For people with no concept of brain chemistry, none of that read as a side effect. That was the spirit arriving. Your own body's reaction became the proof that the ritual was working, and that word, death, keeps surfacing. It's the thread running through everything. Go back to Jirzhankal, that mountain grave we opened with. The braziers weren't sitting in somebody's living room. They were in tombs. Right beside them, archaeologists found a kind of angular harp used in funerals, and human bones with injuries that hint at sacrifice. So picture the scene you'd have been standing in: a body in the ground, music playing, fire crackling, and smoke thick enough to bend your mind. Researchers think the whole point was to reach the dead. to thin the wall between the living and whatever comes next, just long enough to say goodbye. This is the part most people get backwards. For these cultures, the high wasn't the goal. It was the bridge. You weren't chasing a feeling. You were trying to cross over to someone you'd lost. But grief and spirits are only half the story. Because somewhere along the way, people noticed this plant did something else entirely. It made pain go quiet. Travel east, into the heart of ancient China, and you meet a legend named Shennong, remembered as the father of Chinese medicine. The story goes that he tested plants and poisons on his own body to learn what each one did, and his discoveries fed into one of the oldest medical texts in China, the Pentazao. Cannabis is in it. They called it Ma, and they described it with a strange, almost poetic contradiction. It was both yin and yang, both gentle and forceful at the same time. That text carried a warning that sounds oddly modern. Take too much of the flowering tops, it said, and you'll see things that aren't there. Take a little overtime, and your body feels lighter. They had worked out 2,000 years ago that the dose was everything, and it went further. A surgeon named Hua Tuo, around 200 CE, is the first person on record to put his patients to sleep for surgery using cannabis mixed into wine, an anesthetic, roughly 18 centuries before modern medicine claimed the idea as its own. So if cannabis was medicine, a bridge to the dead, and a sacred smoke, where did the disapproval come from? Because somewhere, the attitude flipped. You can actually watch it happen. Remember Herodotus, the Greek? He wrote about the Scythian smoke tent the way you describe a bizarre foreign custom. Fascinated, but with his nose wrinkled. To the civilized Greeks, sipping their wine, breathing smoke until you howled was barbaric. That's one of the oldest recorded cases of one culture looking down on how another gets high. And in China, something quieter happened. Over the centuries, as farmers bred cannabis to be better rope and better seed, the potent, mind-altering varieties slowly faded out of the medical texts. The plant that once opened doorways got tamed into a crop. The magic, in a sense, got edited out. Here's the last turn, and it's the one that ties all of this to right now. For thousands of years, smoke was something you stepped into, a tent, a tomb, a ritual. It had a time, a place, and a reason. Then the world started moving faster. Those mountain graves sat right along the Silk Road, the trade route stitching China to the Middle East, and as merchants moved, the practice moved with them. Cannabis traveled into India, where sacred texts celebrated it as a giver of joy and a releaser of fear. But the habit you'd recognize today needed one more ingredient, and it arrived from the opposite side of the planet. Tobacco and the smoking pipe crossed over from the Americas after the 1490s and spread across the globe within a single century. Suddenly there was a portable, personal technology for turning leaves into smoke whenever you felt like it. The ritual no longer needed a tent. It fit in your hand. And that's the quiet shift. Smoke stopped being a ceremony you entered on the worst day of your life and became a thing you could do on a Tuesday alone for no reason at all. The sacred slid into the casual. So why did ancient people fill their lungs with smoke? Not to party. They did it to bury their dead, to heal their sick, to reach for a world they couldn't see. Every time you watch someone light up today, there's a thread running all the way back to a frozen mountain tomb and a howling tent. A 2,500-year-old human stretching for something just past the edge of the ordinary. The plant never really changed. We did.